You can go ahead and start, Mike.
Well, hello to everybody around the world. We certainly welcome you to this webinar. I'm Mike Morris at the University of Notre Dame, and I coordinate the Global Partnership for Poverty and Entrepreneurship. Any of you interested in joining, there's no fee, but it is a resource portal that focuses on research, teaching, and community engagement around the poverty and entrepreneurship interface. In addition to the portal, we do a series of webinars each year on topics that relate to the poverty and entrepreneurship interface. Our focus today, and I'm going to share my screen, our focus today is on the informal sector. And so I'll do a little table setting here. So I hope you can see these slides. But our issue with the informal sector and particularly micro enterprises in the informal sector is its role, its impact on poverty, and its potential to be a pathway out of poverty, or at least change the economic circumstances of those in poverty. So in terms of table setting, the informal economy is generally broken down into two large groups: the workers who are in organizations but don't have contractual protections, and so in terms of labor law, in terms of social protections, and self-employed individuals who are typically running very small enterprises. I'm intrigued that one of our panelists, Dr. Gill, will argue that all these people are entrepreneurs. Importantly, our interest is the second group, those starting businesses that are informal. What I think we fail to appreciate is the scope of this sector, that it's 80% of the GDP of some countries, more than 50% of the GDP of most developing countries, and even in developed economies, it's as much as 23% of GDP. It is the single biggest source of startup activity in the world, employing hundreds of millions of people, generating large volumes of goods and services, and is an important economic lifeline for a significant part of the population in virtually all countries. Part of the challenge is, how do we conceptualize or define the informal sector when it comes to entrepreneurship? Are these unregistered businesses? Are they unlicensed businesses? Are they businesses that have no banking relationship? Do they lack accounts and bookkeeping in terms of transaction records? Do they simply not pay taxes? An issue we'll come to. Critically, we make a mistake, I think, in oversimplifying and overgeneralizing when we talk about this sector. It is indeed a highly fragmented sector with different segments, and those segments have different needs and different behaviors. But the appropriate way to segment the informal sector is less clear. We need typologies that can help us better address and capture and develop policy around this sector. The key question has to do with performance, and how does the performance distribution of these businesses vary by country, by region, by community, by industry category? Even more fundamentally, what are the relevant performance metrics? Are we talking about sales, rate of growth in sales, net income, inventory turnover, return on sales, jobs created? And what types of informal sector businesses perform better over time, and why? This issue of performance is starting to be addressed by scholars and in the research. Here I try to suggest some of the many variables that may be factors in explaining the ability of some of these informal sector businesses to perform better. At the individual level, demographics, gender, age, place of birth, whether they migrated from another part of the rural area villages to urban areas, their identities, their networks, their entrepreneurial alertness. At the organizational level, the extent to which they're more entrepreneurial, have a stronger customer orientation, some of their management practices or business models, their ability to differentiate at the ecosystem level. And obviously these ventures are largely ignored by entrepreneurial ecosystems, but the kind of training or mentoring or microcredit that's available to them, and then societal institutions, whether those are educational or taxation and regulation when it comes to informal sector, cultural norms, technology and its accessibility. I think our interest in performance is tied to this question: can the informal sector move people out of poverty? And here there are multiple perspectives. Dr. Canales, who was to be one of our panelists, talks about a bidirectional relationship where the informal sector causes poverty and poverty causes the informal sector. Malik suggests it plays a critical role in poverty alleviation. Truong provides evidence that the impact on income is fairly nominal. And Tipple talks about it simply as a source of augmentation to salaried work. So as we explore these issues, we have an outstanding panel today. I'd like to briefly introduce them. I mentioned Dr. Carla Canales. She is tied up with a family emergency and so is not able to join us. Dr. Kaveri Gill is a professor in the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, Shiv Nadar University in India. Applying an interdisciplinary and heterodox economics perspective, her research collates around critically interrogating growth and development in India, and particularly the role of the state. She's authored a seminal book on the informal recycling and waste economy in India. Her PhDs from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Ariel Newman is a professor of entrepreneurship in the Department of Entrepreneurship and Emerging Enterprises at Syracuse University in the USA. Her PhDs in political economy from the University of Utah. Her doctoral dissertation focused on the fascinating question of voice in the informal economy. And she has published a number of important papers on a continuum of informality, legitimacy, and the informal entrepreneurship and informal entrepreneurship in different contexts. Dr. Antonio Baez Morales is an associate professor in economics and finance at the University of Guanajuato in Mexico. His PhDs from the University of Barcelona. His primary research interests are development and labor economics focused on the informal economy, labor informality, and the formal-informal microenterprise. With the informal sector, he's investigated important questions about the relative efficiency of these enterprises, the determinants of informality, and the impact of the sector on direct foreign investment. Dr. Andrea Floridi is postdoctoral researcher at the International Institute of Development Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. He specializes in formal entrepreneurship and international cooperation initiatives and projects aimed at strengthening the private sector, such as through credit lines, training, and economic integration programs. And finally, our final panelist is Dr. Constance Gunhidzere, who is a social worker and has a doctorate degree in social work from the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. She works in the Center for Social Development at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Her research focuses on social protection, community development, poverty alleviation, child welfare, and entrepreneurship. She may join us or not be able to join us. She's experiencing load shedding in Johannesburg, and so may not have power for some or all of the panel. And so without further ado, I want to warmly welcome our panelists and kick this off with the definitional issue. I wondered if you could comment a bit on how we define this sector and what are some of the issues surrounding the definition and the implications of the definition.
Well, I guess I could go first because this is something that I have to start every research presentation with this definition. Because as soon as you talk about informal economy, all of a sudden people are saying, oh, drugs? No, not drugs. I'm not talking about cartels. Oh, organized crime. No, I am not talking about the mafia here, right? And so definitions are very important to designate what is this space that we're exploring. My personal favorite is the definition presented by Justin Webb and his colleagues in an Academy of Management Review article, where it's legitimate but illegal, right? So according to the laws and the regulations that are codified in the civil statutes and regulations, the formal institutional environment, what they're doing is illegal. They lack business licenses, they lack permits, they lack that designation from the state. But what they're doing is socially, culturally, morally, pragmatically legitimate, right? So one great also definition that I really like from Chen 2006, she wrote, right, it's legitimate goods and services through illicit means, right? So again, it's this really interesting tension between what is legal and what is appropriate behavior. So that's the informal economy, not talking about drugs, not talking about cartels. That's a different criminal economy. But things that we say, yeah, that's okay. It's okay for you to sell your food or your wares, but you're not necessarily have that same designation from the state that a formal registered business would have.
Okay. Antonio, in a Mexican context, is that a definition you're comfortable with?
Yeah, I was hearing what Arya was talking about. Yes, I agree, because when you talk about informal activity, many people think maybe they are in drugs or they are selling illegal stuff, but it's not in that way. At least in our research, we don't take this kind of definition. We take the definition when, for example, what is not registered before government, but they are working on legitimate issues. They are selling legal stuff. So, well, for me, the simpler it's the better. But we have a problem when the definition is very simple. So for me, the most difficult part of when you define informal economy in a simple way is the way you can measure it. So maybe it's simple, more or less it's simple to define it, but when you try to measure informal economy, informal sector, it's more difficult to capture what you need to know about the society. So I think this is a key point when we need to split. One is the conception, and another thing is how you measure it.
So we tend to dichotomize. We tend to say it's in the informal sector or it's not. Ariel, I know you talk about a continuum of informality, or you use the term semi-formal, which suggests that they may have bookkeeping, or they may pay taxes, or they may have a license, but they're not formally registered. Or could you talk a little bit about this continuum and what it means?
Right. So Antonio, I feel you when it comes to measuring informality, it can be very difficult to distinguish that. And I came across that in my dissertation work when I was studying petty traders in Ghana who paid taxes but didn't have any business licenses, permits, or other recognition from the government. And it was really difficult for me because I'm like, well, you know, have they gone through the bureaucratic process of formalizing? No. But they still have a relationship with the government in that they pay their taxes, and all of them would show me their receipts, right? And they say, this gives me the right to trade here today. I paid the government a tax, and it would say on, it was a pink slip, and it said tax of, you know, 1 cedi or 50 pesos or whatever the tax was of the day, right? That they could operate there. And so this really had me struggling with the literature that really makes it very black and white. That business licenses, registrations, some of the things that you pointed out, Michael, in the beginning of the panel, right? They had some aspects, but not all of them. And so, you know, some of the new literature is calling for this continuum to really examine what does it mean to be in this truly gray area. It's not black or white, but it's really this mix and what we're calling and referring to as the semi-formal economy. And so in this way, right? So for example, my petty traders in Ghana, they're paying a tax. And does that constitute a relationship? Well, they sued the government and it went to the Supreme Court of Ghana to decide whether or not that constituted a legal relationship or not. And so it did entail some rights underneath the Constitution of Ghana is what it came out to be. But it created this really unclear question of how formal do you have to be? And when we think about the definition of the formal economy, meaning abiding by the rules and regulations, how many businesses truly are entirely formal, right? That they're paying all their taxes, that they're paying into all the Social Security welfare benefits that they should be, that they're not doing anything under the table or informal. And so you have to really break apart and understand this very complex, very multifaceted nature of what informality means. And my main research is a lot of that semi-formal. What does it mean? What does it mean for the entrepreneurs? What does it mean for their businesses? What rights are they entitled to versus what potential punitive measures could be taken against them? And so it's this really interesting space. And I'll tell you right now, Antonio, I'm a qualitative researcher. So measurement is not as much of a hard thing because I'm not doing any large end scales where I'm trying to distinguish that dichotomy. But I feel like that's a really important aspect of this research is to go with a qualitative inductive lens to understand what does this really mean and how are we interpreting this, because it doesn't match what a lot of the previous literature that made it very dichotomous appear to be.
Andrea, do you have a perspective on this?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I am. My perspective is quite in line with Ariel. In my work, usually, I often refer to web as well, to the paper that distinguish between legitimate and legal. But also, I develop. And I often move within a framework that start from the continuum of the ILO 2002. But I made it a bit. I try to make it a bit more radical. So part of my studies, especially my doctoral studies, were exactly about developing this idea that is in line with the semi-formal economy, which is what I call the borderland economy, actually, which is quite similar, perhaps, as a concept, which is exactly the idea of not having a borderline separating formal and informal dimension, but rather a land in this continuum. So the idea is that, of course, the ILO 2002 already and the Chen already indicate that informal work can take place in the formal sector, which represent already an element of overlapping. So the borderland is defined as the space of overlapping between formal and informal economy. And I try to push it further by saying that is the space of institutional overlapping. So there is the space where formal and informal institutions are actually again, pardon the term again, overlapping, and not only contrasting or divergence. So that's a bit the idea. And then moving it even further, starting from this idea, I try to operationalize. So I am also a qualitative, but I like also, I am a mixed method. So I try also to operationalize. So what I did is starting from the ILO 2002, which referred to the, when it comes to informal enterprises, refer to the the United Nations system of account. So the definition of informal enterprise as an unincorporated enterprises that is not involved of that doesn't keep accountability because either is too small or for other reason. So I identify 3 criteria, which are the registration, the bank account, and the official balance. And the combination of these 3 criteria gives basically informal, formal, and is what I call transformal. Transformal because go beyond the formality. So from the idea of the transfinite from George Cantor, the mathematician. So that's a bit for me the idea. There are these hybrid firms, and interestingly, there can be a kind of overlapping between these transformal firms or semi-formal firms, how we want to call them. That perhaps they could be that missing middle that we are looking for. They could represent a kind of mixture of upper tier informal enterprises and lower tier formal enterprises. Also because there is, I'm sorry, I want to close also by stressing that I found also similar paper in line with my study, and Ariel study by, is a book by Williams and Rand, if I remember well, Williams and Rand, who also move within a similar framework. They actually identify 4 types of enterprises. So like fully formal, informal, partially formal, or informal.
Ariel, I think you wanted to jump in.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to say, like, by the way, so nice to meet you. And you're finding some, some great synergies with our work. I love how you call it the borderline and you talk about the overlapping, because a lot of these firms, right, they're operating with, for example, a bank account or paying a tax. And so, I always bring this back to something we're very familiar with here in the United States, Facebook Marketplace, right? People are using these formal organizations. They're using, for example, PayPal and Venmo, which are in electronic bank account form, to run businesses. My dear friend runs an entire company using Etsy and Facebook Marketplace for baby gates made out of fabric, right? She has no business licenses. She's not paying any state taxes or national taxes, but she has a formal bank account. She has, right, some of these things. She's paying fees to Etsy and to Facebook for using the platform. And so I'm like, you're a semi-formal entrepreneur. You're operating in that borderline between. And so I also wanted just to point out that it doesn't exist just in these developing contexts, but it's here, and it's my next door neighbor, right, who could be operating these kinds of ventures. And so we talk about the impact and why this is important to investigate is it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It just looks a little different depending on the context.
So Dr. Gill, you've been quiet now, but you've taken a deep dive working with some of the poorest of the poor, but looking at garbage collectors, scavengers, recyclers of scrap in your important book. And if anything comes across, it's that there are different it's a fragmented, segmented sector. Could you talk a little bit about the segments or the fragments that are there?
So thank you, Michael. Before I do that, I'd like to just come into the conversation. So I agree with all the previous panelists, 2 things. One, when I actually was engaged in the research for the monograph and the book, I wouldn't have put it so as a good student of economics and how the ILO and mainstream economics sees the informal sector, Keith Hart, all of that. But today, if you ask me to define it, I think I would go with the Kalyal, Sanyal, and Rajesh Bhattacharya definition of an economy of surplus labor, which is a product of the process by which the capitalist economy secures its resources minus the people who traditionally lived off these resources. And I say this in the context of increasing informalization of work, even in the global north, as Ariel is saying, other panelists have mentioned. This continuum of fall into informal, we far from an end to the informal sector, we in fact see its expansion in today's world. And therefore, I feel such a definition which actually talks about, how exactly this informal economy comes into being is really very pertinent. So if you ask me today, I would go with this definition. On the continuum and all the gray areas, I agree with Ariel, Antonio, Andrea, all the panelists. I think the typologies that exist are, very, very, I would say, simplistic, both on the enterprise and the worker end of things, both of them. And so then in that context, Michael, when you asked me about the book, so I would say, yes, very much so, I think if I had to put it in a certain way, I would say in the Indian context, for sure, the urban poor are definitely in the informal sector. Everybody who's in the informal sector is not necessarily poor.
Right.
I think it's a three-mode relationship in terms of logic. And if we look at this sector, so as I mentioned in the book, you see these Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, by definition, and even in terms of the activity, you were, in the opening introduction, you were talking about, performance. And I think the performance element comes in, Michael, because it's about survival, right? So in fact, on the entrepreneurial end, I have rarely seen communities who are more entrepreneurial. And in that sense, going back to your questions, it is a question of need, So you see that scale, and then you see the worker, casual wage, informal salaried, all of that. But I want to bring it back, what Ariel was talking about, the continuum. I feel the informalization of the formal, Michael. And I say this in the context of waste work in India, I would say possibly in the global south. There is a move to privatize it, to so-called formalize it. But what does it really mean for the workers involved? Definitely in the Indian context, the labor segmentation by caste and all of that is as tight as it was before. And the conditions are no better. In fact, they are worse. So what the previous panelists were saying, how do we even measure? And is there any benefit to doing that? This formal, informal kind of, I think it's more pertinent than ever in 2023, both global south and global north, and we all have to think about this question.
I have to ask you, Kaveri, because I think you said that we can only expect this sector to get bigger. Did I hear you right?
Yes, Michael. Well, certainly in the Indian context, we do not see it shrinking. And post-COVID, one could say that's an anomaly. But I would say even taking out the COVID, kind of blip, we are seeing an increase in this sector, increasing precarity, more women, younger people, so far from it, in the informal sector economy coming to an end, at least in the Indian context, and I would say in many contexts, it's the opposite direction, definitely, an increase.
Thank you. So, in the entrepreneurship field, and I think policymakers and other people look at things the same way, but and some of that is I think even reinforced by the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. We talk about necessity versus opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, that people are either pushed into entrepreneurship by the sheer circumstances, sheer need, lack of job opportunities, or they're pulled into entrepreneurship via opportunity. And the bias or the dominant thinking in the literature seems to be the informal sector is all necessity driven. And yet in my own experiences over the years working with low income and disadvantaged entrepreneurs, Going all the way back to the first study we did on the shebeens in South Africa, these bars inside of homes during apartheid, I'm always struck by the extent to which the entrepreneur the informal sector entrepreneur has a clear opportunity in mind. And so I wonder if you could comment on this dichotomy. Is informal sector entrepreneurship all necessity entrepreneurship, or is there more to the story?
So if there, I totally agree with you, Michael. I would say that at the macro level, it is the pull factor, it is the need. But within the informal economy, I would say the entrepreneurial end is the desired, it is the goal, it is the kind of mecca for those who have some kind of capital. And within that, it is relatively by far the better option, and would be for many people, both economically, but even the kind of freedom and the conditions, And in this regard, I would just want to put out some data. Azim Premji University does a State of Working India annual report. And, they looked at the data post-COVID. And one of the interesting things was that there was a huge jump in informal employment during the COVID time period. Within that, the self-employed, which was 30%, it's far more the general category and the majority Hindus who fall in that categories. And the marginalized castes and minority communities fall into casual wage work. So there you have it. I would say for people who have the capital, and this was the same in the waste work, anybody who had any access to capital would have a go at an entrepreneurial venture because it made sense economically, and I think in terms of dignity of work, freedom, conditions, all of that. So I would say to you, yes, there's that sort of, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Other perspectives on this opportunity necessity distinction?
I would say it depends on the context. Going back to my next door neighbor who's selling fabric baby gates, she saw an opportunity. She couldn't find something that was attractive and appealing for her house. She didn't find something that would work well for her and for her needs. She needed something that was lightweight, that wasn't hard and cumbersome like the metal baby gates. So she made it out of fabric. Does she need the money? No. She is an upper middle class white woman in upstate New York. She does not need it. She's not having any financial needs. She saw an opportunity and she's going for it, but she's also uncertain about its future. So I also see the informal economy as a testing grounds. A lot of entrepreneurs begin their ventures informally. You don't register your business on day one. And so I see it as not, of course there is some necessity driven. We see that around the world, specifically in developing contexts and or marginalized populations. You do see that in the United States, but you also see it as a testing ground of sorts of, do I want to do this? I'm not willing to invest in the full amount that it'll take to register my businesses. I don't make enough to pay taxes to make it worthwhile. So for the example, in the United States, if you make less than around $6,000, the IRS will never blink an eye. Right? And as long as you keep your Venmo payments under $600, you can use that as your banking and you can use it for personal use, right? Exchanges. So I see it as a way for a lot of entrepreneurs to test an opportunity, to see if they want it to flourish and to grow. Another thing that I've also seen is that depending on the context and the meaning of entrepreneurship, in Ghana for women, it's part of your identity to be in the marketplace and to be trading, right? It's seen as you're a mother and you are a trader. And so you're running your business as part of an identity. And in that context, why would I ever register? I don't get any benefits from the state. There's no paybacks. There's no return on investment, right? I asked one woman once, why would I ever register? Was her response. She looked at me, and the word for a white person in Ghana is Obruni. She said, Obruni? Why would I ever register? She sold sharpening rocks. Why would I ever register rocks? I mean, she thought I was insane for even suggesting formalizing her venture. There was no purpose. There was no need. No one was going to penalize her. No one was going to take her business away. That's how business operates in Ghana. And so she's fine with it. So, and She didn't need to be there financially. Her husband was a very successful farmer. It was her social connections. It was her identity as a woman. And that's where all her friends were. Where she wanted to be was the marketplace. So no, I don't see it as all pull. There's that element. There's a lot of different opportunities, be it financial opportunity, be it social opportunities to make friends and to have those connections as these women had. And I see it as a testing ground. And depending on the context, it can be the de facto organizational form. Why would I ever bother registering? Does it make sense in some contexts?
I think that's such a critical point, and I think that we failed to really appreciate many of the benefits. We focus on the costs of informality, but the benefits of informality, maybe we don't understand or appreciate it as much. Andrea, did you have a perspective on this?
Sure. First, I actually agree also with you that might be over simplistic to actually split and to draw a parallel between informal, necessity-driven and formal, opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. So first, I would agree with you. I would say that there is I would quote Berner et al., a study from 2012, who they actually identify at least two types of informal entrepreneurs, which are growth. They call growth oriented. I would usually I like more market oriented, perhaps, because there is not really this intention to contribute to the growth and so on, but not always at least. So market oriented and survivalist, and so these usually. I would say that while the survivalists are, which are also more exploited, more likely to be also a kind of exploited activities, are necessity-driven often. I would say that the upper tier or market-oriented are rather opportunity-driven. But I think it's interesting also to cite another, because the point here is that sometimes they can be opportunity-driven, but within a constrained context. So I remember also another really prominent paper by Grimm et al., again, 2012. They identify another category next to these two, the survival and the market-oriented. They call it the constrained gazelle. So the constrained gazelle, which are these informal enterprises that try to escape from the larger predators, which are the government with the tax revenues, basically, and with the, of course, officers. And also the other predators are the larger firms, and they adopt this interesting strategy that for keeping the return to capital, return to investment higher, they keep smaller the size of the business, and rather than upgrading, they open another small business, still informal. No, so this can be an example of an opportunity which might look like a necessity-driven because they keep it small, but then is actually perhaps an opportunity, because within a constrained context. But that was a bit my pick on this.
So serial entrepreneurship in the informal sector. It's interesting.
Correct.
You're talking about this. Our own work, we sort of distinguish between what we call survival, lifestyle, managed growth, and aggressive growth ventures, and overwhelmingly find survival ventures in the informal sector. And Antonio, I find looking at these business intriguing because they're lean and they make a lot out of a little. And yet they can't afford equipment, and they can't afford, or perhaps don't understand, technology. I want to get to the question of efficiency, because to me, they're very efficient with what they have, but inefficient in the context of competing with mainstream companies, formal sector companies. Could you talk a little bit about the efficiency of these enterprises and your own findings? You're on mute.
Okay, sorry. This is a very interesting point for me, but because when you try to measure efficiency of micro enterprises, Well, first point, most of the people think microenterprises or small entrepreneurs are informal. So I say this is not true. There are formal microenterprises and there are informal microenterprises, but most of the microenterprises are informal. That is a reality. But when you see how you use or they use what they have, capital, labor, education, you can see that there is a diversity in the efficiency among microenterprises, efficiency. So you can find that some informal microenterprises in the highest quantities performs in the same way as the formal microenterprises. So in my point of view, you can find microenterprises that can be formal because they have capital, they have education, but I know it's not all the microenterprises, it's only a small part that they have a good efficiency in this part. So in my opinion, if you want to improve the efficiency of small entrepreneurs, there are two key points. One is they have to improve capital, and this means access to credit. And the second point is education of the owner. Financial education of owners of microenterprises have a strong effect on efficiency. So, well, in my point of view, these 2 points are crucial to increase the efficiency of microenterprises: the access to capital and the education of the owner.
Thank you for that. So I have to touch on this point because it intrigues me and troubles me. When I look at public policy, when I look at the general sort of tone of the work out there, the conversation seems to be informal sector businesses are bad, and we need to formalize them. And all our policies should be oriented towards either getting rid of them or formalizing them. And I wonder if that's actually the most productive way forward. I wonder if, as opposed to worrying about whether they formalize or not, we simply focus on helping them perform better, even if they're indefinitely or permanently in the informal sector. Could you comment on that? This preoccupation with getting them to formalize. I know in South Africa, the big thrust of public policy is getting them to formalize.
This is actually a big source of contention for me, because who are we to dictate what is formal? In a lot of the contexts that we study in the global South, they're post-colonial contexts, wherein a foreign institutional system based off of their Western culture, norms, beliefs, values is being imposed on an entirely different cultural context. So, for example, in Ghana, it's a very collective, family-based, right, culture, wherein market queens administer property rights, and she is a part of the community that, right, looks out for everyone. And so it's very much collective. But when you instill individual property rights under formalization, it doesn't match and it doesn't make sense in that context. And so a lot of the policies, when we talk about formalizing the informal, are based off of this Western perception of what we think is more efficient, right? And, you know, I'm not here to argue economic efficiency or any of that, but I'm arguing that if it doesn't make sense in the context, given the taken for granted norms and behaviors regarding economic transactions, then it's not going to work. Why we see the informal economy growing in contexts like Ghana, perhaps in India, right, is that this idea of formalization does not resonate with the cultural, cognitive, normative institutions of the society. Why would I ever register rocks? It makes no sense. But I'm going to pay my dues to the queen, and I'm going to pay my dues to her because she protects me. So again, it depends on what you mean by formalizing. And by doing this cookie cutter, one size fits all, this is how we formalize, this is what it means, individual property rights based off of Western conceptions. No, I think it's a waste of time. And in fact, it can be
back on that a little bit, Ariel.
Okay, that's fine.
Because there are those who emphasize the vulnerability of these businesses, the fact that they operate in a context where they could be shut down or otherwise prosecuted, that as you note, they have no voice. Doesn't that sort of counter it doesn't matter?
Well, then change the laws to focus on the needs and the context. So for example, why not allow for collective formalization under the market queens? Market queens are illegal in Ghana. They are not legally recognized. They have no rights. But that is the system that has been in place for centuries. Why not legally recognize that form of formalization? So when I say it doesn't matter, I mean, depending on the context, this one pathway towards formalization and what it looks like doesn't make sense and doesn't matter. Instead, change the laws to incorporate the voice and the needs and the context instead of, again, one size fits all Washington consensus perspective on formalization.
Thank you.
I think, Michael, I'd like to come in here on this point. And you know what, if we see what Antonio was saying earlier, education, capital, both of those are classic cases of market failure for the poor. So I think that, to your point, I think there's a bit of disingenuous state at play when we talk about wanting this informal sector to formalize. And I say that because, you had posed this question, and to Antonio's point, or to many of the panelists, Ariel's as well, helping the informal sector with what they need, whether it's loans, whether it's a bit of land. If we can set up SEZs, we can surely set up some kind of assistance for the poor informal enterprise sector. So there are ways and means of doing all of that, but we do not do any of that, or rather the state does not. And then we impose all this illegality and illegitimacy of the business, all of that Ariel is mentioning. That I find really disingenuous. And there I agree with the other panelists that in fact, then the best way to survive is under the radar. In fact, you must never come to the notice of the state because, for instance, in the case of India now, with some of the change in the GST laws, a small micro enterprise may have to file their taxes online or whatever kind of formal paperwork once a month. And they don't have the capital, they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the technological literacy. So we are imposing all these kind of restrictions and conditions on them and actually not providing or addressing any of the market failures. If we look at economics, what it would say about loans and education and all of that, that I find very problematic.
So let's turn to the question that I find most important, most provocative, and that is the relationship between the informal sector and poverty. Is investing in the informal sector or empowering the informal sector a viable way to reduce poverty?
I would say it's the only way ahead. Where we stand in 2023. I would say it's the only pathway ahead, at least from a global South lens and looking at the scale including, for example, if I think now about the gig economies, retail, if I start including a broader sector of workers and enterprises. The question is, Michael, whether investing in that sector, it goes back to the previous question. How serious is the state about actually doing something for these people, as opposed to sort of retrospectively calling anybody who ends up self-employed as an entrepreneur, or, just a convenient label. This has come up in the Indian context, where we haven't had formal employment generation, and, there's a lot of educated youth without jobs. And the answer given there is that you're as well off, that's because people have chosen not to be in work, and it's all about becoming an entrepreneur. While I agree that there might be some element of that, depending on the age group and the demographic, there's also a large chunk of those who just cannot find opportunities worthy of their, aspirations. And so there, the question is, how serious is the state about this entire cohort?
Sure. And I take it you think they're not especially serious. And Antonio, you've done some fascinating research looking at aggregate economic numbers. In a Mexican context, if we look over time, would you argue that the informal sector does alleviate or make a difference in the poverty circumstance?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because when you see the context of Mexican economy, and when people see that there are low wages and no job opportunity, informal micro enterprises and informal entrepreneurs is a good opportunity to survive, to buy stuff, clothing. So informal micro enterprises is, for me, is a real option to save you from poverty. So for me, this can alleviate or make a difference with the poverty in Mexico. Most of the people, when you see the data, most of the people in Mexico is working in this kind of informal micro enterprises, and they can survive. And most of them, they cannot, or they don't want to change their situation. They don't want to go to a formalized job. Why? Because, as all the panelists say before, I have more advantages of being informal, because maybe I don't pay all the taxes, because I have flexibility in my job time. Well, I think it's in Mexico. It's a good source of alleviate poverty.
Okay. Thank you. We're getting some interesting questions from the audience. And I see from Franklin, Blanca, Philippe, that there's a theme across these questions. And let me pose it to you, Andrea, or at least to start with you. The theme seems to be, what should the role of government be when it comes to the informal sector? Whether that's general policy, or whether that's support for ecosystem development, or could you talk a little bit about public policy needs with regard to the informal sector?
Yes, thanks for this question. I think it's also quite strictly connected to what we were talking before. So one thing, I would like to just briefly say that connected also to this formalization, just getting back also to what the previous panelists were saying, formalization should not be the end, and we have to clarify why, not per se. Okay, so we have to clarify what is it should be a tool for achieving something. So for instance, if it's for promoting a decent work, So for pushing decent work agenda, of course, yes. But if it is, for instance, for increasing government tax revenues, then it would be counterproductive for two reasons to target the survivalist smaller enterprises. Because first, you would not obtain, you are not likely to obtain much revenues, and second, because this would end up sinking and might be sinking their activities and might be counterproductive in this sense, especially when these activities are actually connected with poverty, which is the second thing that I want to say. So, but when it comes to the and to the ecosystemic factors, we can mention for sure. We mentioned before the credit, business development service, incubators. Although to a certain extent, one can argue that informality per se is already an incubation. That's what a bit what Ariel was saying. But again, I want to point to one thing that is strictly connected also to the poverty. The issue is an economic issue, but is also a socio-cultural issue. Before Professor Gill mentioned also the caste system in India, but to mention one. So often the truth is that often many of these poor are also minorities, are also at the margin of the society. They are marginalized, and it's also one of the reasons why they are in the informal sector. There are many ethnic conflicts. There are many other issues. Other type of conflicts that characterize in different contexts. So, based on my experience, I would say that the conductive, the key issue is also an integration, okay, a cohesion, a social cohesion. So to a certain extent, it has to be economic. So we have to provide, of course, credit. One note, sorry, that sometimes credit can create indebtedness among smaller. So yes, credit, but with certain mechanisms that can protect, of course, the smaller enterprises. We have to, of course, provide business development service incubators, but also focus on factors that are not strictly economic if the objective is really tackling poverty. That's my personal pick.
I guess where I struggle, especially if we're dealing with the poor, people in poverty circumstances, is, you can have an incubator, but if I'm a single mother with 4 children and I'm trying to start a business while also working at some low-paying job, I can't visit the incubator when it's open. If we talk about training and that kind of support, the training has to reflect the literacy problems that we're dealing with. And I don't just mean reading and writing, but you can provide microcredit, but if people don't have financial literacy, it's problematic. Kabir, I know you've done a lot of work around public policy and the role of government. How do you view this?
I think it just goes back to, this whole notion of, when we are defining these two sectors, Michael, and what kind of support and at what level of state, right? So when you were asking earlier, in India, the state is providing some kind of, social benefits in terms of food, 100 days minimum employment, which is like a Keynesian program, for public works, those kind of initiatives. But when we are talking about the informal sector, both the workers and the entrepreneurial end, especially, Michael, I find that, their vision is not aligned. They want to regulate this sector. They want to bring it into the fold. But their means of doing that, as other panelists have focused on, is more imposing things on them. Like I'm saying, many kind of criteria, administrative, with huge transactions costs. And there isn't much thinking about them. As you said previously, maybe they are seen also as a marginalized bunch to begin with. When we talk about entrepreneurs in the informal economy, we never speak of them as we do speak about entrepreneurs in the formal economy. There is that tendency. I think just the way it's positioned, So when you're talking about street vendors, you're talking about other kinds of, wherein the economics, the economy of it might be very, very self-sustaining and worthwhile, but somehow the lens of the state does not see it as a valid entrepreneurial activity. And I think this comes back to then our main point about, what is the role of this sort of informal sector, and therefore the Sanyal and Bhattacharya argument that there is this kind of surplus labor situation. Because, for example, Michael, in the waste sector, when things became viable, they were privatized and formalized. So when things become at the respectable end, both socially, culturally, and economically very viable, then I think it is seen as something that needs to be taken into the formal private and mostly private sector. So I think that this policy vis-a-vis the informal sector is really not thought out very well, certainly in the Indian context. We had workers just leave cities in droves, during COVID. There was nothing to fall back on, and they went back to some kind of, small base in rural India. And if you think about what that means in terms of productivity, livelihoods, all of that, you just have to wonder. So I think there needs to be a lot more thought about this. I am with you and all of the panel. Like, I think the opportunities are really there. But it's not as simple as a de Soto argument of we just kind of, give them some sort of property rights or some kind of legitimacy. It's a much more complicated issue of how this sector is seen and, what is its role, and how willing the state is to actually take steps in that regard. This I find is lacking.
Ariel, how do you see the policy needs, the ecosystem needs, the support needs for this sector?
It's a very complicated question because, right, just doing policy change at the top level doesn't address all the depth and all the roots of what's happening. So, for example, when I was talking about voice, a policy was made in Ghana that just said, okay, new marketplace, everyone who's formal gets a stall, who else is not doesn't get one. Okay, what does that do to the 4,000 people who've been trading there for 20 years, some of them, and who've been paying daily taxes? So again, thinking about meeting the entrepreneurs, the people where they're at, providing services that are context-driven, solutions that incorporate that voice. Because, as I often argue, is that these marginalized populations are left out of the room where the policy is being made. But they are vested stakeholders in the results of these policies. So bringing them in and coming up with solutions to where those entrepreneurs are at. Your example of the single mom who is creating a business, right? Okay, meet her where she is at. She might not have enough money or enough bandwidth or enough time to make this a formal venture. Does she really need to? She's not making that much, and she can go under the radar and make enough to make it worthwhile, test it, see if it's something that's valuable and viable for her. Meet her where she's at. I do that a lot with specifically my students. When I was at University of Southern Mississippi, I had a lot of students who were coming from extreme backgrounds of poverty, first generation students. And, it had been ingrained in them that, yes, you need to get the business license, you need all these things. I said, well, can you do something small and informal, test it before you invest resources you don't have to waste to make sure this is something that you both want and can do. So again, finding people where they're at, creating policy, creating initiatives, creating interventions that take into account the entire context and the entire person that you're dealing with, their motivations, their needs, and their constraints based on the structural system that they're embedded in. That's what I would say. So I don't have a magic bullet. I wish I did. Someone asked for my recommendation and I said, there isn't one. There really isn't. I can't tell you. I can tell you for one specific context at a time.
Thank you for that. One of the issues that intrigues me in the work we do with the people in poverty circumstances, is a dominant scarcity mindset. And so if I live in a world of trade-off decisions, if I live in a world where I pay a medical bill or I pay for food, it forces me to live in the moment. It forces me to adopt a very immediate term focus. It seems to me a lot of the intervention programs around entrepreneurship begin and end with writing a 5-year business plan, which is kind of a silly idea if I'm living in the moment. And so I guess my question is, how can we support the informal sector in a way that, to grow a business and to increase revenue and to be able to pull more income out of the business, it seems to me requires that I move beyond this scarcity mindset, that I start to think a bit more strategically, think a bit not as every decision in isolation. Do you have any perspective on this? Just the mindset challenge of a lot of the necessity, especially driven informal sector entrepreneurs?
Well, I'll offer some insights, take it for what it's worth, but you do see that, right? And it's this immediate trade-off of, if I pay for example, in Ghana, it's about $3,000 once all thing is said and done to register and to do all the things that you need to do. And it'll take about a year. Okay. When all said and done,
I'm smiling because it's $95 in Indiana.
I was going to say, I can register my business for $95 online, takes 5 minutes in New York. But again, so you're thinking about those trade-offs, and that's a power of the informal economy, is it gives you a place to test and to see, is this worth that, right? Even for me, I say, oh, it's only $95. But for some folks, that is a huge investment for their business. And so, for example, right, what can you do? Take those small steps and really enjoy the playground that can be the informal economy before you have to invest in those resources. The formal economy does come with protections. It comes with guarantees of property, for example, in the United States. Once you're registered, you can, if something happens to you, you can file for insurance. You have access to the judiciary, to the police. Right? If it's informal, you don't want to report something that was stolen because what you were doing was technically illegal. So it does come with those benefits. But if you're living in the now today and you're not sure about the longevity, the sustainability, the fit of this venture for you, is that $95 and all the time and other fees that are associated with being formal really a benefit? And so that's, again, why I say, meet them where they're at and test and suss and be like, sometimes that's not quite the right fit immediately. Maybe it's a goal in the future. And then depending on the context, if they get services from formalizing and they get that return on that investment, then perhaps it is an end goal. In contexts such as Ghana, where it's really what will paying this actually benefit me? Does it actually provide protection? Or, for example, Chris Sutter and Jeff Kistrak has done work in Guatemala, where once you register, you're now a target for cartels and for extortion from criminal bases. Again, that's not beneficial to formalize. It puts you in jeopardy. So it's driven by that context. And I think it's just so important to continue to reiterate because it's hard. And that's what makes this such an important topic to discuss in forums like this, because it's not an easy one-fits-all solution.
We're coming down the home stretch here. There's a question from the audience. It's actually directed to Dr. Gill. The question is, do you believe this transaction cost lens might be part of why informal entrepreneurship seems to bridge class, race, and geopolitical differences? In answering that question, I wonder if we could and today's an ideal day for that. Talk a bit about the role of gender in all of this. It seems to me there are a lot of gender-related kind of issues, but I don't know if you want to address the basic question, Kaveri.
I think gender, Michael, I haven't personally focused on that as much, but as I said, the data on India, certainly women and younger workers fared much worse in terms of informalization post the COVID. And I think if you look at the nature of the kind of work that we are talking about, it would make sense. They also have not come back to the workforce at all post COVID. So, also relating this to your previous question, I think the risk factor in the informal sector, whether it's just, having a bit of capital, then again being pushed down into a worker category, and therefore being, dominated by this scarcity mindset. Or in the case of women and other kinds of, marginalized identity with intersectionality, because for many of them, they might have many other identities that are, for instance, caste or other kinds of, so they live in that kind of fear and umbrella. And I definitely think that, those sections of the informal sector, again, need some particular kind of attention. But I think the way things stand, it is more likely to be provided by the community, by kinship networks, by family, and therefore by definition within the informal sector itself. So even credit and all, we see far more possibilities for Roscars and other kinds of than the state giving. Though in the Indian context, I have to say it right now that some of the big business, the formal businesses get loans quite easily without any kind of, that much of a requirement. But if I'm an informal sector worker and I'm looking for some help, it might be much, much harder. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking as well as the, maybe it's a bit of a stereotype, but of the poor family where the male head of household goes off looking for work and the female head of household is running some kind of enterprise from the home or on the street. Ariel, your examples featured female entrepreneurs. Is it your sense that there's an important gender issue when it comes to understanding the informal sector?
It is indeed. And it could be because of the rules of the game, right? Are women entitled to property rights? Do they have access to resources? Can they own a business in their own name? And if not, then the only option is the informal economy. Another gender imposed constraint is caretaking. If you have to take care of children or the elderly or other members of the family, and you don't have the time to be a, full-time growth-oriented entrepreneur, the informal economy does provide a lot of flexibility to turn it on, turn it off when you need to. That, if you want to lean in at certain times to save up for expenses or whatever it may be, school fees, etc., you can. And so I think that there is a large component, and it can be both from the institutional structure and the legal regulations regarding women and access to business and to resources. And it also can be from that cultural cognitive perspective of what does it mean to be a woman and what are the expectations associated with that gender role in society. Informality can be, right, the only option for a lot of women, depending on the answers to those questions.
Yeah, and I've seen some interesting research about the woman running the informal enterprise making more money than her husband, and that creating all kinds of difficulties in terms of stifling growth and so forth. We're down on time. I did want to give Andrea and Antonio an opportunity, maybe one last perspective on this topic of informality from each of you. We start with Andrea. Or Antonio, you got your mic.
Okay. Yeah, well, I want to give some last point. It's about women in our studies. We observed, we have noticed that in recent years, women have been increasingly involved in the opening of micro enterprises. And in my point of view, another crucial fact is that these women who enter in are doing so with a higher level of education. So under the Mexican condition, when you can find low wages and there is no flexibility job time in the labor market, in my opinion, you can expect a greater participation of women that could have an impact on the probability of the success of microenterprises, the efficiency, the performance of these microenterprises in the future.
Thank you. And Andrea, you get the last word.
Yes, I would like as well to conclude on these women in the informal sector and highlight perhaps is the challenge is double. So women are often penalized for social, cultural reasons, and they are prevented to participate in the formal market, also often in high-income countries. But so the challenge is double because they often also already conduct unpaid domestic work, many. They cannot find an alternative, so they need to look for another source of income because there are often no welfare and no mechanism that actually pay back the work that they do. And next to this, they cannot find a job in the formal market. So again, double challenge because where they find a job is in the informal market when they can. And of course, beside all the issues that that's been mentioned and that I totally agree with.
Well, thank you. And thank all of you for your intriguing and helpful perspectives on this very complicated issue. The webinar has been filmed, and so it will be available for viewing after the fact. But I just can't thank you each enough for taking your time and joining us, especially at different times around the world. And so all the best to each of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was very fun. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for hosting that and for inviting us to come and to share some of our, insights. And it's, like I said, such a valuable topic. And I'm grateful that this forum is taking place. And hopefully, if anybody wants, I see like a lot of people asking for contact. Of course, feel free, email, connect on LinkedIn. We love it.
Well, thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Same here. Feel free to reach. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Michael.